Protests in Cuba saw angry Cubans come out to the streets. This tiny island nation is suffering from a COVID pandemic, which has paralyzed the economy of the country. But what's more paralyzing and detrimental are the cruel U.S. sanctions in place for decades. Hi, I'm govt, and in this edition of Economic Divide, we will look at how these sanctions are not excuses by the Cuban government in its economic shortcomings. Coming up in this program, Cuban protests, the largest in decades due to economic hardships. The tiny island nation has been suffering from U.S. sanctions for decades now. Then we will take a look at what these U.S. sanctions are actually all about. They are comprehensive, they are indiscriminate, and they are quite devastating, from sanctions on oil to currency, which has the most negative impact on the population of the island. Now, the world wants Cuban sanctions lifted. All UN countries except for the US and the Israeli regime. Does the US want regime change in that country?
Recent protests in Cuba. Cubans angry over long lines of food, power outages, and medicine shortages. Like many countries, racked by the COVID-19 pandemic. These were most widespread since Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution. But was this spontaneous, or were there foreign hands at play?
Se gestaron los disturbios en San Antonio de los Baños. Aquí ustedes ven la portada de esa publicación y quiénes estaban detrás de las primeras protestas.
The Facebook group City of Humor is said to be responsible for the protest.
Espontáneo nada. Desde hace tiempo hizo suya esa tarea un grupo de Facebook nombrado La Villa del Humor, refiriéndose a San Antonio de los Baños.
Within hours, President Miguel Díaz-Canel came out and said the streets belong to revolutionaries.
No vamos a admitir que ningún contrarrevolucionario, mercenario, vendido al gobierno de los Estados Unidos, vendido al imperio, recibiendo dinero de las agencias, dejándose llevar por todas estas estrategias de subversión ideológica.
As if the U.S. embargo on Cuba was not enough, now the U.S. was throwing its full weight behind the protests.
The Biden-Harris administration stands by the Cuban people and people around the world who demand their human rights and who expect governments to listen to and serve them, rather than try to silence them.
As much as the U.S. paints a picture that the Cuban government does not have support amongst Cubans, realities on the ground paint a different picture, as seen here.
A pesar del coronavirus, tenemos que defender lo que hemos creído. Para eso estamos aquí. Para defender la revolución que nos ha ayudado y nos ha traído hasta aquí.
The cost of the U.S. embargo on Cuba is immense. The Cuban government estimates that it has cost it $753.69 billion. That's a lot for a tiny island nation. Consider this: Cuba's average GDP between 1970 and the year 2014 was $31.7 billion.
Well, Cubans went out to protest their poor economic conditions, which was one of the largest demos to have hit that island. But that is not the full story, since the picture that is being painted, well, it wants to show that all Cubans are against the government. That is simply not the case. Take a look at these scenes. Thousands of Cubans out on the streets showing support for the Cuban government. They were marking the anniversary of the Maleconazo. That was a 1994 uprising linked to dissidents that saw more than 35,000 flee the U.S.
Estoy acá con nuestro comandante, estoy acá con el pueblo cubano que está confirmando que nada nos va a dilatar, nada va a hacer que nos ablandemos, que vamos a confirmar todo el tiempo que sea necesario.
Cuba, in short, is hit by three main factors that has led to its economic deterioration. Note, deterioration, not its downfall. Today, the global pandemic, the decades-old U.S. blockade, and sanctions put in place under former U.S. President Donald Trump during his last days in office are the three contributing factors. Now, the former U.S. President Donald Trump imposed harsh sanctions on Cuba before he left office. It was in the form of reducing cash remittances from abroad. 2 million Cubans live in the U.S. Out of that number, 700,000 send money to their families inside Cuba, making it the second most important source of hard currency. The figure for the amount totaled anywhere between $900 million and $1.5 billion annually. That's quite a lot for an economy that does not generate a lot of money. And to put things into perspective, so important are these remittances that it is the main source of direct income for half of Cuba's population.
Si es verdad que en Cuba es un estado fallido, que quiten el bloqueo y vamos a ver qué va a suceder. Que dejen que la familia cubana se pueda unir, que pueda haber remesa, que deje que los ciudadanos norteamericanos puedan visitar Cuba.
Now to the embargo itself. The Cuban government estimates that it has cost the island about $753.69 billion. The annual report to the UN provides a detailed account of that calculation. Again, a lot for a country whose average GDP is between 1970 and 2014 has been calculated to be at $31.7 billion. Our guest joining us for this segment is Vern Lyon. He is a former CIA officer. He's also the author of the book Eyes on Havana, which is a memoir of an American spy that was betrayed by the CIA. Vern, welcome. Taking a look at the recent protests that happened in Cuba. Well, Cuba's economy was the reason, but Cuba's economy is crushed due to main three factors: the global pandemic, the decades-old U.S. blockade, and sanctions that were put in place under former President Donald Trump. Now, you have been in Cuba yourself in the past. How do you see things in terms of the way the Cuban economy works?
Well, I think those three factors contribute a great deal to the current state of the Cuban economy. But, you know, even with the North American embargo and blockade, the many years I was in Cuba, I experienced the different Cuban agencies that had foreign devises: British pounds, Spanish pesetas, German marks, US dollars, Canadian dollars. They found ways to buy what they needed through other companies and countries. So the blockade was in effect for some things, but the Cubans always managed to find a way around it.
Now, in terms of the way that the Cuban economy works, overall, it's time to actually take a look at some of its economic indicators and the economic profile of the Caribbean island nation as a whole. Time now for our Info News section. This is where we take a look at other economic news from around the world. Now, these are stories that we're considering for our next program. First up, a shocking report, a moment of truth. Code red for humanity. It's a climate change crisis. It hit the headlines throughout the world. It reminded us how we are failing. Dire warnings about irreversible damage to the climate, so severe that it called the crisis inevitable, unprecedented, and irreversible. Great topic for a program. Now, this topic should hurt the African American community in the U.S. Racism to have cost Black Americans $70 trillion. That's quite a bit, and that's since the start of slavery. Now, Sean Rochester, author of The Black Tax, has said that Black people are hired less frequently, they are paid less, and have less access to wealth-building tools like affordable mortgages. Next up, the topic of U.S. guns has always somewhat been in the news, but this time it's for a different reason. Mexico is actually suing U.S. gun manufacturers over arms trafficking. The lawsuit alleges that the companies knew that they were contributing to illegal arms trafficking, which has been linked to many deaths. Mexico is seeking as much as $10 billion in compensation. And finally, we go to a dollar dump that has occurred. No surprise where it has occurred. Russia's sovereign wealth in this case, the fund, has cut the U.S. dollar reserves to zero. Now, the Russian finance ministry said that the yuan and the euro are seen as an alternative to the dollar. Not only has Russia eliminated the U.S. dollar from its military deals, Russians have opted to dump the U.S. dollar in favor of other currencies like the euro. Okay, we're headed for a quick break here on Press TV, but do stay with us. We'll be right back. It's time now for our in-depth section. Now here is where we will take a look at what many are unaware of, and that's how Cuba's economy actually functions. Our focus more or less is going to be on poverty. But the way we figured is maybe it's best to look at the ways that Cuba's economy should actually not be looked at. Because, well, the usual factors in a capitalist economics, that's basically how the whole world is operating. Those are the things that we don't want to look at here. For example, in Cuba's case, socialism and not capitalist economics is what dictates the way the economy works and the usual hallmarks of a capitalist system. For example, how success and failures is a result of either growth and productivity, whether that is contributing to success or failure in terms of a capitalist system. That doesn't really apply to Cuba. It's good to bring some examples here. For example, GDP per capita or money income per day, again, doesn't apply overall to a socialist system because it's just not applicable. Cuba is a different story. Its social and political priorities are actually very different. Let's take a look now at another couple important factors, hunger and homelessness, very important obviously. Now Cuba, due to its socialist system, has eliminated a couple things. Here, child malnutrition and homelessness is actually eliminated pretty much, or close to it being eliminated. That means that, for example, no children sleep on the streets. In fact, homelessness is almost at zero. Now, a look at Cuba's economic needs, salaries, residence, etc. The salary for an average Cuban per month is $900, very low, but still it's something that is allocated by the government. But that does not determine the standard and quality of living for Cubans. Because, for example, in terms of residency, we're taking a look at how 85% own their homes, and also rent cannot exceed 4% of a tenant's income. Now, in terms of food, well, the government itself provides a very basic food basket for every Cuban. That suffices for a family of four. And then finally, if you want to take a look at things like utility bills, well, a few examples here. Transport, for example, and medicine, they are very low, and one of the reasons behind, for example, medicine costs being kept low is because it's being subsidized by the government. However, let's not get carried away. It's not as if Cubans are all happy people that are cared and provided for. After all, they did come out and protest due to the economic hardships that they were experiencing.
Creo que la gente salió a protestar porque tiene necesidades. El país está pasando por una situación económica difícil, pero creo que dialogando entre ambas partes, entre el gobierno y las personas que se oponen, que se llaman así opositores, puede llegar a un balance y solucionar la solución sin que haya interferencia de personas de otros países ni que se complique más la situación.
Now, the U.S. President Joe Biden did not help when these protests broke out, since he responded by actually branding Cuba a failed state. And he went ahead and sanctioned the military and the police there.
The United States is taking a concerted action to bolster the cause of the Cuban people. We brought to bear the strength of our diplomacy, rallying nations to speak out and increase pressure on the regime, and we're holding the regime accountable. Last week, we sanctioned the head of the Cuban Armed Forces and a government entity called the Black Berets for their involvement in suppressing protesters. And today, we are adding sanctions against the Revolutionary National Police, as well as individual sanctions against the chief and deputy chief. The chief and deputy chief.
Classic Biden way. Well, the Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel, who, although blaming the U.S. for the protests, immediately reacted actually with promised reforms.
Aquí hay una estrategia económica y social que la conseguimos cuando empezó la crisis de la pandemia, en la que hemos venido trabajando. Que hemos sido lentos en algunas cosas, es verdad que hemos sido lentos, y esa crítica está, y yo fui el primero que la reconocí públicamente en varios lugares. en varios lugares, pero nosotros vamos avanzando y muchas de las cosas que estamos aplicando en estos días coincidieron el tiempo ahora, pero eran las que se venían trabajando. No hay inventos nuevos, estaban en esa estrategia económica y social.
Okay, Miguel Diaz there. Reforms have been in the works, actually, and have been applied during the time that Luis Castro, Fidel Castro's brother, ruled the island, even though the U.S. sanctions and then Trump's sanctions made things harder.
La primera medida de corto plazo fue permitir la importación sin aranceles de alimentos, productos de aseo y otros productos. Y realmente yo creo que eso fue una medida importante. La otra medida es que la gente que tenían un vestuario que no se lo vayan a poner, lo vendieran sin ningún problema, que es la venta de garaje. Otras cosas que permitió, yo creo que es importante, es en aquellos mercados industriales que tenían productos de lenta rotación, darlo a crédito. Eran cosas tan elementales que en el mundo entero se vende mucho a crédito, pero eran cosas que no estaban implementadas en Cuba. Yo creo que otra de las facilidades que se están dando es esa, la importación de equipos que puedan producir energía eléctrica. Eso a grandes rasgos a mí me parece que son las más importantes.
Okay, now what he's referring to there is basically credit which Cuba is prevented from getting because of the U.S. sanctions. No credit anywhere in the world, even institutions designed to help countries like Cuba, namely the IMF. Okay, let's bring in our guest for this section of the Q&A. Gloria Estela La Riva is a Latin American expert. In the year 2016, she was the U.S. presidential candidate of the Party for Socialism and Liberation and the Peace and Freedom Party. Gloria, welcome. We're taking a look at the socialist economy that Cuba has. Basically, it's a planned economy. I'm sure you're well aware of that. Contrary to capitalism, socialist market economies produce goods based on usage values. Hence, we can see, for example, how Cubans own their own homes based on a socialist system. They have free education, etc. Can you please explain the way that the Cuban economy works?
Since 1993, Cuba has engaged in a number of economic changes to stimulate the economy, to bring in foreign investment in order to survive the disastrous collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And it has been able to, with investment in its nickel mining, in the biotechnology, which makes Cuba a powerhouse in biotechnology in the world, and in tourism, which until the pandemic year of 2020 was a major source of income for the country. I would say that with the new changes, a new announcement of allowing larger businesses from Cubans and even people who are Cuban living abroad, that this is another attempt to try to overcome the enormous crisis caused by the almost complete shutdown of tourism because of the pandemic and the tightening of the U.S. blockade, cutting Cuba off from bank transactions in the world, following every bit of commerce that Cuba tries to engage in, and threatening countries and companies that do business with Cuba.
Gloria La Riva there. Time now to take a look at another aspect of the way the U.S. sanctions are affecting Cuba, and that is the humanitarian embargo, part of the embargo that the U.S. claims does not apply when it comes to humanitarian needs for the island.
The U.S. sanctions on Cuba are similar to other countries that the U.S. sees as its adversaries, like Iran and Venezuela. The U.S. sanctions are so suffocating that even humanitarian aid is threatened. Both the Trump and Biden administration have always stated that basic humanitarian supplies like medicine are exempt from U.S. sanctions list. It has also blamed the Cuban government for any shortages on food and medicine. Humanitarian organizations are not exempt from this either. Take the case of food shortages and the World Food Program. The WFP wanted to provide nutrition and food security to Cuba, but it failed in doing so due to U.S. sanctions. U.S. sanctions are so severe that even ships that dock on ports other than Cuba are penalized. The cargoes of these ships have to be transferred to different vessels to be brought into the island, causing additional costs.
A critical step that the U.S. has in its embargo of Cuba, which it continues to this day, with the hopes of choking the island is its sanctions on oil. Now, based on a report by Commonwealth, in April, it stated the U.S. Treasury Department blacklisted 34 ships owned by Venezuela's national oil company for shipping crude oil to Cuba, which imposed costly penalties on 2 UK-based oil companies and then imposed additional penalties on 4 companies on 9 more ships in the Venezuelan oil sector, alleging that they had transported oil to Cuba. Now, OFAC continued to blacklist people, companies, and ships from Italy, Colombia, Panama, and Cyprus. It claimed that they all had provided Cuba with oil. Okay, let's bring in both of our guests now to see what they think about these harsh U.S. sanctions, like what I just mentioned, oil, and many other ones that fall under the total embargo of Cuba. Vern Lyon, former CIA officer, joins us along with Gloria Stella La Riva, Latin American expert. Okay, Gloria, first to you. The U.S. is insistent on choking Cuba with its sanctions and also stoking the flames of anti-government protests, the way that the U.S. President Joe Biden did recently, not only supporting them but also imposing additional sanctions. This is while his predecessor, Barack Obama, rolled back some of the economic restrictions. Why do you think the U.S. and Joe Biden, in this case, are so harsh against Cuba?
I believe that the U.S. objective is absolutely regime change, overthrowing the revolution. And if that were to happen, which I do not believe will happen, but if the government were overthrown by U.S. force, it would mean a bloodbath. And this is why the people are resisting for over 60 years a brutal blockade whose target is the people of Cuba. The U.S. claims that they want to free the Cuban people, but they're in fact punishing the Cuban people to try to make them give up their health care that's free, their education that's free, a country that's free, in order to be able to exploit it like it used to be.
Well, Vern, do you agree with Gloria that the U.S. is after regime change in Cuba, even though she says that's not going to happen?
Well, in that regard, the U.S., even when I was sent there, was thinking about a regime change. But after the October crisis, when the United States agreed not to invade Cuba anymore, like they tried in the Bay of Pigs invasion in April of 1961, the agreement with the former Soviet Union was that the United States would never again invade Cuba to try a regime change. What they did attempt to do, and what part of my mission was to bring about the way that the Cuban government is established, to bring about elections, to bring about different political parties and political viewpoints, and move away from a one political party dominant political system.
Okay, we appreciate that. That's Vern Lyon, former CIA officer, and prior to that, Gloria Estela La Riva, who is a Latin American expert. All right, we have shown you how Cubans, some are dissatisfied with the way things are in their country, but many, if not most, support the governments. And that is something that's very evident in the next piece that you're going to see in terms of the way that Cubans have come out supporting the government that currently is something that's in favor with most of the population there.
Cedemos la palabra a continuación.
Desde el propio triunfo de la revolución, el imperialismo norteamericano ha estado tratando de derrotarla. Y para ello han usado todo tipo de armas, incluyendo las agresiones directas, pero sobre todo han usado un bloqueo que es único en la historia de la humanidad, que ha durado casi 60 años. Pero el pueblo cubano es un pueblo revolucionario y sobre todo en el día de hoy, en muchas partes de Cuba, el pueblo está expresando su apoyo a la revolución.
Y estoy aquí hoy patentizando el apoyo de la juventud cubana a la revolución, al socialismo, a nuestro proyecto socialista y repudiando grandemente todas las protestas que se han realizado de forma violenta. Nosotros lo que necesitamos es paz, prosperidad,
somos capaces de defendernos ante el imperio y llevamos 60 años de revolución y nadie nos ha podido doblegar, que no podemos permitir que nos avasallen.
The former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo once said about Venezuela with a lot of eagerness, no food, no medicine, now no power. Next, no Maduro. Well, it seems like the Biden administration is taking the same strategy when it comes to Cuba. Inhumane, yes. Interference in another nation's affairs, also yes, not to mention a violation of a nation's sovereignty. But if the U.S. is really concerned with humans and human rights, why doesn't it lift the Cuba embargo that has been in place for over 4 decades? Take a look at this. The UN General Assembly has called on the U.S. to end the Cuban embargo now for the 29th consecutive year. 184 countries have voted in favor of a resolution to demand the end of this blockade. Only the U.S. and Israel have voted against it. Now that should tell you something. That does it for this edition of Economic Divide. I'm govt. It was great to have you with us. Any questions or comments, please do send them to us. Until next time.